Breakfast wasn't rushed, but it wasn't fancy either. It was built from habit, repetition, and whatever the kitchen already had. Some mornings were quiet, some were loud, but the food was always the same kind of promise. You won't leave the table hungry. These are 20 breakfasts my Southern grandmother actually made. Not for holidays, not for company, but for real mornings, real people, and real life. 1. Biscuits and gravy. Biscuits were never optional in my grandmother's kitchen. They were the heart of every breakfast, expected and unquestioned. She didn't measure or follow recipes. Flour went into a bowl, cold fat was worked in with her hands, and milk was added slowly until the dough felt just right. She handled it gently, knowing too much pressure would make the biscuits heavy. Rolled lightly and cut cleanly, they rose straight and tall in the oven, ready for whatever the morning demanded. The sausage gravy was thick, peppery, and slow cooked. She browned the sausage carefully, letting the fat render fully before stirring in flour and gradually adding milk, allowing it to thicken naturally. When it coated the spoon, she knew it was ready. Breakfast was served with biscuits split and smothered completely in gravy, steam rising as it soaked into every layer. It wasn't fancy, just hearty, warm, and filling. The kind of breakfast that steadied you and carried you through the morning with comfort and satisfaction. 2. Fried eggs with bacon grease. Eggs in my grandmother's kitchen were never fried in a clean pan. They went straight into whatever grease was on hand, usually bacon fat saved from the day before. She believed throwing grease away meant you didn't understand food or kitchens. Every bit had a purpose. The skillet was hot when the eggs went in. The edges sizzled, curling slightly, while the whites spread and began to set. She never flipped them. Instead, she tilted the pan and spooned hot fat over the tops, letting the whites finish cooking while keeping the yolks soft, bright, and slightly runny. Timing mattered. Too long, and the yolks overcooked; too short, and the whites stayed slippery. These eggs weren't plated with care. They were served on split biscuits or beside thick cornbread, yolks broken on purpose so they soaked into the starch. Simple, hot, and filling, made from what was already there. Nothing more was needed, and in her kitchen, that was always enough. 3. Grits with butter and salt. Grits were treated with care and seriousness in my grandmother's kitchen. They were never instant, never rushed, and always cooked slowly while watched closely. She believed grits could sense impatience, and if you hurried them, they would never turn out right. Water and salt went in early, long before the grits thickened, and she stirred constantly, steady and unhurried, making sure nothing stuck to the bottom of the pot. The heat stayed low, just enough to keep everything moving gently. Butter was folded in at the end once the grits had softened and settled into themselves. The texture mattered above all else. Never runny, never stiff, just thick enough to hold a spoon upright for a moment before it sank back down. No extras were added unless requested. No cheese by default, no sugar ever. Grits were meant to be savory, grounding, and deeply filling. Served hot and plain, they carried the quiet weight of a proper Southern breakfast, staying with you long after the meal ended. 4. Country ham and Redeye gravy. Country ham wasn't an everyday breakfast in my grandmother's kitchen, but when it appeared, everyone knew the morning was different. Thin slices were laid carefully into a hot skillet, frying until the edges curled and crisped, intensifying the salty, smoky flavor into something bold and unmistakable. The pan held a dark, sticky fond that captured every bit of that richness. Redeye gravy was made right there, without ceremony. Hot coffee was poured into the skillet, hissing as it loosened the brown bits and released a sharp, bitter aroma that immediately woke the senses. This wasn't polite, delicate gravy. It was working food, meant to start the day with intention. She ladled it sparingly over ham or biscuits. Too much would drown the flavor, too little, and it lacked punch. Redeye gravy wasn't about covering the food. It was about sharpening it, cutting through richness, and reminding you to eat with focus and respect for what was on your plate. 5. Cornbread, crumbled in milk. Cornbread crumbled in milk was one of the quietest breakfasts my grandmother made, and one of the most telling. It usually happened when the house was still half asleep, before the day demanded much of anyone. She took leftover cornbread from the night before, never fresh, and broke it apart by hand into a bowl. The pieces were uneven, rough, and soft at the edges, exactly the way it was meant to be. Cold milk was poured over the top, soaking slowly into the crumbs. She added a small pinch of salt, just enough to sharpen the flavor. Sometimes there was a bit of butter dropped in, left to soften and melt on its own. Sugar was never part of it unless the bowl was meant for a child, and even then, only a little. She ate it slowly, spoonful by spoonful, often standing at the counter or sitting by the window. There was no conversation and no rush. It wasn't exciting food, and it wasn't meant to be. This was breakfast that eased you into the day, gentle and familiar, offering comfort without asking for attention. 6. Fried apples with biscuits. Apples were peeled by hand, sliced thick, and cooked slowly in butter until they softened. My grandmother never rushed them. She let the heat stay low, giving the apples time to release their own juices. Some mornings she added a little sugar, other days she didn't, trusting the apples to do the work themselves. The goal was never sweetness for its own sake, just balance. They weren't cooked down into jam or syrup. The slices stayed whole, tender, and warm, holding their shape while soaking up butter and heat. Spoonfuls were served over split biscuits, where the apples slid into the crumb, or eaten straight from the bowl without ceremony. It was a quiet kind of breakfast, gentle and forgiving. Even on busy mornings it slowed things down, just enough. Warm apples on the stove made the kitchen feel calmer, and for a few minutes, that was enough. 7. Sausage patties and Cathead biscuits. The biscuits were enormous, rough cut, and perfectly imperfect. True Cathead biscuits. My grandmother never worried about neat edges. She scooped the dough, pressed it just enough to hold, and set heavy, uneven rounds on the pan. They baked tall and sturdy, dense enough to split and fill, not admire. Sausage patties were hand-formed, simple, and unadorned, just meat, salt, and pepper. She fried them slowly, letting each side brown deeply, the aroma filling the kitchen long before anyone sat down. Breakfast was eaten with hands, biscuits split, sausage tucked inside, grease soaking through fingers, crumbs scattered, plates barely used. It wasn't tidy, but it didn't need to be. This was hearty, unapologetic food, made to be enjoyed, and every messy, flavorful bite was appreciated without question. 8. Scrambled eggs, soft and slow. My grandmother never scrambled eggs dry. She believed doing so wasted both the eggs and the care put into making them. Eggs were beaten lightly, just enough to break the yolks, and poured into a pan over low heat. Butter went in early, melting slowly to coat the skillet and prevent sticking. She stirred gently, letting soft curds form naturally rather than forcing them into shape. She pulled the pan off the heat before the eggs were fully set, letting residual warmth finish the cooking. The result was creamy, tender eggs, seasoned with salt only at the end to preserve moisture. These eggs were usually served with toast or biscuits, quietly eaten without fanfare. This wasn't a breakfast for busy mornings or large tables. It appeared when someone was sick, tired, or needed care. Soft scrambled eggs were her way of offering comfort through food, gentle, steady, and restorative, made to nourish both body and spirit before the day continued. 9. Molasses on hot biscuits. When money was tight, molasses appeared without ceremony. My grandmother kept a jar in the cupboard, thick and dark, reserved for mornings when there wasn't much else to stretch a meal. Biscuits were split warm and buttered generously, then drizzled with molasses, letting it soak into the crumb and turn it a deep, rich brown. It wasn't a dessert or a treat. Molasses was bittersweet, heavy, and strong, and that was exactly why it worked. It filled you quickly and stayed with you, sticky fingers and all. Plates were licked clean, eaten quietly without fuss. Everyone understood its purpose. My grandmother said molasses kept you going longer than sugar ever could, and she believed it. Practical, honest, and reliable, it fueled long days of work, offering comfort and energy without pretense. Simple food, doing exactly what it was meant to do. 10. Fried potatoes and onions. Potatoes were sliced thin and cooked slowly in a well-used skillet, often alongside onions. My grandmother never rushed this process. She believed good potatoes demanded patience, and burnt edges meant the heat was too high or attention had wandered. The pan stayed steady, hot enough to brown without scorching. She let the potatoes rest before turning them, so the edges crisped while the centers softened. Onions went in early, melting slowly and infusing every slice with sweetness. Nothing about this breakfast was fancy, but everything was intentional. When finished, the potatoes were crisp at the edges, tender in the middle, and deeply savory from the pan's fond. They were served with eggs sometimes, but often eaten on their own, straight from the skillet. The aroma alone filled the kitchen, signaling the start of the day and making everyone feel the morning had already begun. 11. Leftover cornbread and butter. Cold cornbread was never wasted in my grandmother's kitchen. Thick slices were cut from the loaf and reheated in a skillet with butter, the edges crisping and the centers softening just enough to feel fresh again. Some mornings she toasted it dry, letting the heat bring out a nutty flavor. Other days she fried it lightly, so the butter bubbled and browned against the pan. Either way, it was simple, satisfying, and completely unceremonious. It was eaten plain, no explanation needed, no sugar or jam required. Leftovers were never treated as second-class food. They were proof that yesterday's work had been enough to nourish the family and carry them into today. The act of reheating and eating cornbread like this was quiet, practical, and comforting. It reminded everyone that even yesterday's humble meal could still bring warmth and fullness, and that small, unassuming foods often carried the deepest sense of care. 12. Ham biscuits, wrapped in paper towels. This was breakfast on the move, meant for mornings when the day wouldn't wait. Biscuits were split open and thin slices of ham, sometimes cold, sometimes warmed in the skillet, were tucked inside. My grandmother wrapped them quickly, usually in a scrap of paper or a clean cloth, and handed them over without fuss. There was no plate, no sitting down, no ceremony. The sandwich was meant to be eaten while walking out the door, standing by the counter, or riding in a wagon or car. Hands got a little greasy, crumbs fell where they may, and no one minded. She believed breakfast still counted, even if you didn't sit to eat it. It didn't matter how hurried the morning was, a warm biscuit with ham in hand could carry you through until the next meal. Practical, filling, and made with care, this was food designed to keep the day moving without ever compromising on flavor or sustenance. 13. Boiled eggs with salt. Eggs were boiled carefully so the whites set while the yolks stayed soft, pale, and slightly creamy. My grandmother timed them perfectly, knowing overcooking would make them dry and chalky. Once done, they were cooled just enough to handle and brought to the table for peeling, each shell removed by hand. They were seasoned simply with salt and eaten plain or with bread. There was no garnish, no fuss, no attempt at presentation, just practical, functional food. These soft-boiled eggs were breakfast for busy mornings when the family needed something quick but nourishing. Quiet, dependable, and sustaining, they gave energy without ceremony. Each bite was simple, steady, and exactly what was needed to start the day right. 14. Pancakes cooked in bacon grease. Pancakes in my grandmother's kitchen weren't the fluffy diner kind. They were thin, heavy, and cooked in the same skillet that had just held bacon, soaking up the lingering salt and smoke. Each one sizzled gently, edges crisping while the center stayed soft and tender. When they came off the heat, syrup was poured over, sometimes thick, dark sorghum, other times whatever was on hand. The sweetness blended with the smoky, savory notes from the pan, creating a flavor that was indulgent but grounding. They were eaten quickly, often stacked high, butter melting into every layer. Each bite carried warmth, richness, and comfort. These weren't delicate pancakes. They were practical, satisfying, and the perfect Southern breakfast to start the day. 15. Leftover greens with hot sauce. Greens didn't stop being useful just because it was morning. Leftover collards, turnip greens, or even mustard greens were reheated slowly in a skillet until they were steaming and tender again. My grandmother always served them alongside thick slices of bread, letting the bread soak up the flavorful liquid left in the pan. Hot sauce was non-negotiable. Just a few drops brought out the smoky, earthy flavors of the greens and added a punch that woke up the taste buds. No one complained about vegetables at breakfast. In her kitchen, they belonged at every meal, and mornings were no exception. This wasn't fancy or delicate food. It was practical, nourishing, and filling, a quiet reminder that breakfast could be hearty and balanced at the same time. The greens carried flavor, warmth, and sustenance, proving that even the simplest leftovers treated with care could make mornings feel substantial and satisfying. 16. Milk toast. White bread was sliced thick and toasted just enough to hold its shape, then broken into a bowl with care. Hot milk was poured over it, warm and soothing, and a pat of butter melted slowly on top. A pinch of salt rounded everything out, cutting the sweetness and adding depth. This was quiet food, unassuming, soft, and gentle. It wasn't meant to impress anyone, nor to fill a hungry crowd. It appeared on sick days, grief days, or mornings when nothing else sounded right. My grandmother believed it worked on more than just the stomach. It was food for the mind and spirit as well. Each spoonful carried warmth, comfort, and familiarity, slowly softening the edges of whatever had made the day hard. It was simple, steady, and exactly what was needed to feel held. Even in its plainness, it had a quiet power, the ability to settle, restore, and remind you that care could be served in a bowl. 17. Sausage, egg, and biscuit sandwiches. This breakfast was built quickly, meant to be eaten even faster. Soft scrambled eggs, warm sausage, and flaky biscuits were stacked together, pressed slightly, and wrapped tightly in foil or paper. My grandmother made these on workday mornings when there was no time for sitting at the table. There were no sides, no extras, and certainly no presentation, just the essentials packed together to carry you through the morning. Each bite combined the richness of eggs, the savory punch of sausage, and the comforting texture of the biscuit. It wasn't a meal to linger over. It was practical, portable, and satisfying enough to hold you until lunch. She believed breakfast counted even when you were in motion, and this simple, handheld combination proved it. It was food with a purpose, nourishing, filling, and ready to face a day of work without fuss or delay. 18. Fried cornmeal mush. Cornmeal was cooked thick, left to cool and set overnight, and then sliced into hearty pieces the next morning. My grandmother fried each slice slowly, letting the edges turn golden and crisp, while the centers stayed soft and tender, giving a perfect contrast of textures in every bite. Sometimes it was served with syrup, dark and sweet, soaking slightly into the warm interior. Other times it was eaten simply with a pat of butter and a sprinkle of salt, letting the natural corn flavor shine. This wasn't fancy or new. It was old food, the kind her mother had made long before convenience became a priority. It was cheap, filling, and reliable, a breakfast that stuck with you and carried the family through busy mornings. Every slice held warmth, tradition, and the quiet reassurance that simple, honest food could be enough. 19. Coffee and buttered toast. Some mornings were just that, quiet, simple, and slow. A strong cup of coffee steamed in a mug, paired with toast spread thick with butter, was all that was needed. My grandmother made sure it was eaten at the table, allowing the warmth and flavor to be savored without rush. There was no conversation, no fuss, just the gentle rhythm of morning and the comfort of a meal that didn't demand more than your attention. Breakfast didn't always need to be elaborate or piled high to feel complete. On days like this, simplicity was enough, steady, grounding, and quietly satisfying. It reminded everyone that nourishment wasn't always about quantity. Sometimes it was about taking a moment to start the day right, with food that warmed both body and mind. 20. Whatever was already there. The most common breakfast in my grandmother's kitchen was simple and practical. Leftover meat, bread from yesterday, reheated potatoes, and cold biscuits came together without fuss or ceremony. Nothing was wasted and nothing needed explanation. She believed breakfast wasn't about rules or presentation. It was about starting the day fed and ready. Plates were filled generously, hands dug in, and everyone ate quietly, letting the flavors of yesterday carry them into today. It wasn't glamorous, but it was sustaining, made with care, and a reminder that simple food could be enough to begin the day fully prepared. My Southern grandmother didn't call this tradition. She just called it cooking. These breakfasts weren't planned for nostalgia. They were made because people needed to eat. Before work, before school, before life asked too much, and somehow, without trying to preserve anything, she preserved everything.